Hey there, comrades. Welcome to Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Hope everyone's doing well out there. Thanks for joining us this week for our show. Hope you've been enjoying all the high-quality content, or at least attempted high-quality content we've been putting out there, and you've been loving what you're hearing and are coming back for more every week. As promised on our last show, this week we have Comrade Zoya on to talk about the very interesting, very sci-fi friendly text by Shulamith Firestone called The Dialectic of Sex, the Case for Feminist Revolution. I think you're really going to love this one. It's a great way to encounter a period of writing and thinking in the feminist movement that maybe we've lost a little bit. And Firestone really has some fascinating ways of engaging with psychoanalytic, Freudian thought, Marxist analysis, the imagination of science fiction and utopian thinking, and rolls all that together into, I think, a pretty compelling critique of family structures, of gender, and of the limitations of the new left movement that emerged in the 60s and into the 70s, and what exactly happened with the limitations of that movement that necessitated the birth of what we know as second-wave feminism today. So let's dive right into the episode. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you back here afterward for a few brief comments. All right, welcome, Comrade Zoya, to Red Library. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Pleased to be here.
Well, I am pleased for you to be here. So I guess, what are we reading this week? What did you want to talk about?
I'm going to be talking about The Dialectic of Sex, the Case for Feminist Revolution by Shulamith Firestone. This book was actually published in 1970, and I think that it's really fallen out of favor, particularly in feminist theory and women's history, women's studies courses. And I think it's also it's fallen out of favor in leftist circles too. And I think the reason for this is just that it's a really radical book. It's really out there. I think there's a lot of poo-pooing about second wave feminism that sees it as being very not addressing problems of race, class, or really anything besides bourgeois white feminism. And so I think that there's just Shulamith Firestone has been left behind in a lot of ways because she is associated with that milieu. But I think that this book is really special. And the reason I want to talk about it is because it's maybe one of the first books, and I think one of the only books that I've read of that era of feminism that is really making a case for radical class-based feminist revolution that is a full overturn of the structure of society that addresses all the different... Hold on, let me take a step back.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I think there's a lot of good stuff in The Dialectic of Sex. Firestone really, a lot of it is critique of the feminist movement up until 1970. She addresses all these kind of cultural and social issues, things that have been left behind in feminism and in Marxism in particular. She engages a lot with Freud and Marx, Engels. I think Wilhelm Reich is in there, even if he's not explicitly referenced in various places. But
shout out to Wilhelm Reich.
Yeah,
I didn't even
shout
think
out
we were going to
Fourier. Real good characters in there.
It's real OGs.
Yeah. But I think that the coolest part of this book is actually the end when she starts making these demands for what has to be done, and it almost crosses into this sci-fi level of what a radical transformation of sex and class and society would look like. And she takes all these ideas about sex and gender, childbirth, sexuality, detaches them from the body, and kind of says that women's bodies are used to keep them in this other, to keep them oppressed. And one of the huge aspects of that is that women are expected to go through childbirth and to be mothers, and to remove that from women's bodies will have this liberatory effect that has been unachievable until now. So it's about politics, revolution, but it's also about science. It's a little Star Trek-esque in that.
I'm digging it.
yeah, in
That's
that
awesome.
way.
Just to step back, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So on the way that we typically approach things on Red Library is that we want to make it very beginner friendly and not necessarily
Right.
assume that someone has a whole history sort of just at their beck and call about,
Yeah.
let's say, the developments of different waves of feminism. So
Okay.
whenever you describe Firestone as being sort of this neglected kind of lost part of second wave feminism, how would you characterize what second wave feminism is in a very kind of broad sense for someone who isn't familiar with it?
Okay, so to understand what second wave feminism is, you really have to understand what first wave feminism was.
Of course.
And so first wave feminism was very much a bourgeois white women's movement that began, I mean, I guess it's hard to say when it began. I think it's generally associated with the 19th century, but I would say that as early as, I think it's like 1790, when Mary Wollstonecraft published Vindication for the Rights of Women.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the onset of that earlier feminism, which was very much focused on, women should be able to vote. They should be able to own property. They should be able to participate in society. But of course, that was white bourgeois women. Key figures in that movement range everywhere from, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, who were really advocating for voting, but also just for women to be able to wear comfortable clothing that they could ride bicycles in, and that kind of thing. I think Betty Friedan is another author of The Feminine Mystique, really drew out the kind of ways that marriage and the station of women really keeps them from participating fully in society.
Well, I was wondering about that. So it's an interesting way to describe first wave feminism. It's almost as if the goal is to integrate women into society more fully so they're able to participate at the same level of kind of depth as men.
Yeah.
But not necessarily challenging the overall structures of society, economy, class, gender relations, and obviously race relations, I'm assuming, is in there too, right?
Yeah. But I think that even more, I think the goal of first wave feminism wasn't even for women to have the same rights as men. It was very narrow in its scope. I think it really was centering around just the right to vote. And once women got the right to vote in 1920 in the United States, they had the right to vote in other places at different points in time. It became clear that there were just a lot of other issues with the ways that women were able to participate in society. Like up until I think the 60s, possibly even the 70s, women could not have credit or credit cards if they didn't have one in their husband's name. It's just it wasn't even about things like being able to vote or go to college. It was these very basic kind of ways of how do you live as a woman in a man's world. And I think second wave feminism, it actually grew out of the leftist movement. So starting around 68.
So like New Left.
New
kind of
Left.
period,
Yeah. I believe actually there's it's hard to just pinpoint a moment when a movement began, but I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but I'll get back to you on it because it's on my bookshelf, and something that broke it's a really great kind of more recent history of feminism, particularly second wave feminism, but it spans from about 1950 to 1990 or so. There were tensions in SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, where the women in the group felt that they were being mistreated. Their ability to influence and participate was very much dictated by how high up the people they were sleeping with were, and they were not listened to. They were relegated to doing kind of like cooking, cleaning, organizing, and not given credit for that work. The similar thing was going on with SNCC, these new left movements. In the preparations for the DNC protest in 1968, the women in SDS got frustrated and they all started their own caucus within the group so that they could be listened to and get shit done. And that's kind of this spark of that second wave of feminism, which was tied to the leftist movement intrinsically. It was born from it and from the ways that the leftist movement did not address the needs of women, but also the participation of women, and was very hypocritical in that way. And so that's what differentiates it from first wave, which was very much a bourgeois movement that accepted the status quo of society and just said, well, women should be able to participate the way that men do. And the second wave of feminism says, there's all this talk about transforming society, of transforming the world, and all these men keep saying like, it'll be different after the revolution, but for now I can sleep with other women, you can't sleep with other men, and also you have to do the cooking and cleaning for my SDS bros.
Oh, so radical of them.
Yeah, I know, crazy. Did that answer the question?
That was brilliant. What was it about second wave feminism, whenever we think now, right? So reading Firestone now, why would you say that maybe we've lost a lot of the writings and the theorizing that went on then? And why do you think this book in particular has been forgotten or kind of lost to history?
I think that the death of the reputation of second wave feminism is really located to that moment. I think it's like Catherine McKinnon. The radical liberation of women got so pinpointed and intense that it aligned with the far right in terms of just sexual repression of pornography. There were just these porn trials, the whole know it if I see it thing. And so the same radical feminists were on the side of the governor of Ohio, who wouldn't let Robert Mapplethorpe's exhibition show. Like it became associated with censorship, with being really out of date, with not really understanding, with being stuck in this moment and not kind of moving towards more radical spaces. That was in the 80s. And I think, there's that. There's also like third wave feminism is really what called the death of second wave feminism, which you could think of as being that kind of 90s riot girl, Judith Butler, queer theory moment, which said like, second wave feminism, it was trans exclusive, it was race exclusive, it was prude, we're in the moment of sex positivity, which totally erases like some of the ways that feminism was intertwined with sexual liberation. But I think that the reason that this book, that the Dialectic of Sex is kind of lost, is there's no one reason. There's a lot of things. And I think it doesn't fit into the idea of what second wave feminism was. And it doesn't fit into the idea of what the new left was. It's weirder than both of those. Firestone engages a lot primarily with Freud and Marx and Engels, and it's kind of impenetrable for people who aren't students of those works, which I think just today is most people.
Yeah. I don't remember the last time I was just, hanging out at a gas station and struck up a conversation about Freud and Marx.
Yeah. So it's not just an issue of, people don't read difficult books anymore. They don't have a context in Marx or Freud, because any, 20-year-old English student will say like, oh yeah, I've read Benjamin, I've read some Adorno, a little Heidegger.
Yeah.
Maybe not Heidegger anymore. He's really out of vogue. But
being
some of
a
those
Nazi is tends
some
to do that to you.
Some of those Frankfurt School people, maybe Marcuse, but I think that the huge difference there, it's not because Firestone is a woman, although maybe there's some level of that, but I really think it's that it's very easy for English professors to take selections from Adorno or Benjamin and put them in a context that does not acknowledge the radical politics behind them. But there is nothing in the Dialectic of Sex that is not political. It is a political text. You can't excise Shulamith Firestone's feminism from her Marxism, from her radical politics, from her theorization as Freudian, from her futurism. Like it's all together.
Yeah, almost kind of a totality. It's sort of, you can't take any piece of that without getting the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a political book. When she wrote it, she intended it as a political book. It's subtitled The Case for Feminist Revolution. And even though I think there's a lot of qualities in it that would be really useful to people studying Freud or psychology or feminism or even, science fiction, there isn't a way to present that without presenting the structure that holds it together, which is feminist, radical, Marxist revolution.
You mentioned the futurism in it.
Right.
And you started off by saying that it has this sci-fi quality of laying out some sort of program of the world after the feminist revolution would at least have some qualities that we could state pretty clearly, like it would look like this.
Yeah.
And I think that's I'm really excited to hear you talk about this because I think that's so rare, especially now. And I don't know if that's something that also fell out of favor once the sort of right backlash happened in the 80s and into the 90s, of where we have this inherent terror, I think, about stating positive political goals.
Right.
And a positive political vision out of fear of it would be called utopian, it would be seen as inherently repressive, or would have this totalitarian potential. And I think that's also a huge backlash of the Cold War and the liberal and conservative terror about anything remotely resembling a socialist, communist, Marxist, feminist sort of revolutionary potential.
I think I'm going to take a few steps back just so that comes at the end of the book after Shulamith Firestone kind of makes her critique. I should probably have started. The beginning of the book is really presenting, that this failure of leftism up until that point has been to truly engage with the woman question. Mm-hmm. And while there have been previous critiques like Clara Zetkin, someone I can think of just offhand, who is kind of pushing the problem of women during the Soviet Revolution. She was friends with Lenin, maybe some kind of romance with him. I don't know, but she was. We're
not going to speculate.
Yeah,
I mean, we don't want to spread gossip on this show.
Yeah, but that's like that talk was always happening. It was touted by the Soviet Union that men and women would be equal, blah blah blah. But Shulamith Firestone starts her book by saying this hasn't really been addressed at a core level. It's only been addressed at this kind of surface problem level. That if revolution happens, men and women will be equal, and it doesn't. And while that's like this huge important step, there have to be more steps taken, or else just post-revolutionary society will repeat a lot of the trapped constructs of bourgeois society and some of the things that she lays out. I'm just gonna
let's dive in.
Walk through the table of contents. Basically, she lays out that critique of Marxism as the structure of the book. She then kind of moves on to a short history and critique of American feminism, and it's these two things together that are the revolution that it's the feminist revolution is also the socialist revolution. They're the same revolution. And then she kind of moves towards Freudianism, and I think Firestone really is a Freudian in a lot of ways, but she presents Freud as the misguided feminist. Like, he's almost there in all these ways, but he doesn't take it to the space of transformation. He only takes it to a place of observation.
And all that cocaine.
Yeah. Well, he sets the stage for figuring out like what it is that creates these negatives, the only word I can think of right now. But Freud sets the stage for the way of thinking about how sex and our bodies and the family creates our psyches, which then create society.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then she, after kind of introducing these 3 points, which are the core of her book, so like Marxism, feminism, Freudianism, she looks at the problem of childhood in society as like this oppressive situation that women and children are lumped together as not complete people, and that childhood, and this is I think where especially Reich comes in, is that children are seen as something other than human when they're just little adults, like they become adults. She then talks about racism, and she associates that chapter is particularly problematic. I think it's worth reading, but I'm not really going to focus on it because I think there's a lot of not just background, but like inside knowledge of what the like anti-racist radical left was like in 1970 that isn't something I really want to spend a lot of time talking about, because she doesn't really address it again later, whereas in the rest of these chapters she does go back to it.
Even if it's just very brief.
Right.
How would you characterize, in even just very broad strokes, what the anti-racist left looked like around that period, or how she understands it?
She quotes Eldridge Cleaver a lot.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a nice start.
Okay. I'll try to answer your question first before I jump into
okay.
a little farther away, but much in the way that kind of the feminist left split from SDS level New Left, I think you had these there were a lot more anti-racist groups, but they were primarily led by white people. SNCC is the main one that I can think of. But around 1970 is around the same time that you start to get this more radical Black anti-racism, anti-colonialism, kind of Africa thing, Amiri Baraka, the Black Panthers, that kind of Maoist slant kind of coming in, and third worldism as being this sort of that essentially race relations in America, in the white world, but particularly in America, are like that maybe there isn't as much potential there for radical transformation as just, starting a different society. And so it's people like looking for connection, looking for solidarity in Africa, in Islam, in just these global oppressed people. I maybe didn't explain that very well.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's in my understanding of that period, the turn towards a sort of like Pan-Africanism,
right,
a kind of third world revolutionary sort of movement about particular like national and racial identities was seen as inherently much more radical and had much more revolutionary potential because of the inherent failures of the left, primarily the white left, organizing around college campuses and around these like, mostly bourgeois groups. So it's a really strange sort of history, because the more that current, in my understanding, becomes strong, the more that the white kind of anti-racist left looked to much more like increasingly marginalized groups of people of color, particularly Black men who were incarcerated, as being the revolutionary subject. So it's a fascinating and like really, really strange and complex history. And it, mostly ends with just a bunch of these groups of like 4 or 5 people, mostly white people, and then a couple of, maybe young Black men and women just bombing government buildings. Right. It's a strange history. I feel like we don't talk about it at all anymore.
And I think that, this moment you're starting to see these more radical Black groups separating from the broader student-based New Left, and even from a more conservative civil rights movement. This kind of an underarching idea that Shulamith Firestone really identifies with, doesn't necessarily think is the correct approach, but that there's something going on with feminism and with anti-racism, Black anti-racism in that time, that is kind of saying like, well, this, we're just reifying these relationships of oppression if we're trying to work with our oppressors in these groups. So we'll start our own radical groups where there aren't those hierarchies. And so Shulamith Firestone takes that, she looks at it, and she really probes, like what's going on with Black women in these groups, and what's going on between white women and Black men and white men. And she kind of pulls apart this way that the Black man becomes, I hate saying this, like the Black man, but Black men become feminized in their relationship of oppression to white men. It's actually like very much drawing from Fanon in that Black skins, white masks. But then she gets like really Freudian with it. It's kind of difficult to parse through.
It's hard to grapple with this period without also understanding whatever anti-racist organizing within the left at that time looked like. So I think even just like having some general ideas of this is also what was going on, I think is really helpful to understand.
So this is this moment of fracture that really begins around 68, when it seemed like revolution would happen, and it didn't. You have all this identity splitting into these separate groups. You also have just a lot more communes and cults, and just really different ways that people are trying to explore transforming their lives, because the possibility of collaborative global revolution feels impossible. And Shulamith Firestone, I think, and this is where that utopianism, that kind of confusing thing is coming in, is she's saying, no, it is not hopeless. It's really important that we have our sights toward like something better, and we're not, utopian visions of the New Left are like very conservative. There are much more radical possibilities, and science is really advanced. It's really possible, if it was something that society wanted to invest in, is these transformations could be made.
So I imagine that connection to sci-fi, to futurism, to this really radical speculative approach, in some way, that's probably, for her, that was a way to sort of preserve that utopianism, or to save it from, I think you're dead on about that, like that really inherent conservative kind of strain that ran through all these groups that were quote unquote like the left or the new left, or even groups in the new communist movement. You know, there were these really deeply conservative strains, and they weren't able to see outside their own conditions, historically, subjectively, objectively, to really understand how to transcend that in any sort of way.
That's this huge part of it. She's drawing on all these pre-existing critiques of the family structure, of marriage. She talks a lot about romance in this culture of like women being told that they need romance, and how that can be painful and controlling because of what romance means in our society. And that this is all tied up into that women are relegated to having this maternal role, and that their physical bodies are used as machines for procreation. What she puts forth is that the sexed body is not sentence. If in vitro fertilization can exist, then the possibility of growing humans outside of a woman's body is possible. And that would release women from all the oppression tied to having to be mothers, for having to go through pregnancy, which is dangerous and unpleasant and restrictive. Maybe a total non sequitur, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Do it. We're very pro non sequitur on this show.
So yeah, I'm teaching a course in the fall semester and the spring semester, actually, that's utopian fiction. And so one of the things that I'm going to assign this book, even though it's not fiction per se, but I'm also going to be assigning some, or at least one episode of Star Trek. And so I was reading up on Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the original Star Trek. And one of his big things is that he didn't believe that marriage should exist on Earth in the future. And so he was really anti having any kind of reference to husbands, wives, marriage, monogamous sexual relationships. Like it was something that he thought would not, that his utopian vision could not include those restrictive social structures. And I think, he channeled that into his sci-fi world, and Shulamith Firestone is presenting it in a much more serious context, a context that's putting forward something that could actually happen. It's utopian, but it's not fiction. It's pushing the limits of the possible.
It almost seems graspable. It's there, even if it's just a little bit outside your field of vision, but it's kind of there as a presence that it's tangible in some way.
She plants that seed explicitly. She says, like, this is a possible future, that this is where Freud ends. This is where like second wave feminism in a lot of ways falls short, is this inherent biological difference between men and women, which is tied to the woman as the womb, as the mother. Okay, I'm going to tie this back to my Gene Roddenberry comment, so it's not completely off the rails. But I think that, you can look at this obvious sci-fi future where it's so natural that that's just not the way that people live anymore, in the same way that, like, Star Trek doesn't say there was a socialist revolution, but like no one uses money. There's no unemployment or poverty, or like it's a different world. And that's kind of addressed in not after the original series. But, I think that Shulamith Firestone is kind of taking this thing that seems utopian, that seems impossible, unreal so far in the future that we can't picture it, and saying, these are the actual steps that could be taken with science to make this possible. And this is a way of, this isn't just a fantasy. This is a way that people could live if that was part of the revolutionary plan.
This is so strange to think about. But, Mark Fisher, who I'm a big fan of, has this idea of lost futures, and how whenever we think about these past revolutionary moments, one of the things that we experience a really deep kind of melancholy about, and a sense of loss, is for the radical revolutionary potentials that were there but were never actualized, that somehow they never manifested fully. And hearing you talk about Firestone, I'm thinking of The Matrix and how one of the most startling features and like images in The Matrix, and I think this is true of a lot of sci-fi today, at least in sort of, mass culture, is that whenever we think about human reproduction and human birth outside of the body, it's this horrible, nightmarish totalitarian thing of, yes, we can produce humans outside of biological reproduction,
right,
but it's only at the service of some horrible, monstrous AI or some sort of thing that wants to destroy us.
The X-Files Eve 6 episode,
exactly.
That kind of thing. Yeah, woman without a mother.
Yeah, and so hearing this, it's just making me realize that that's a potential lost future.
Yeah.
That we don't really describe that anymore, at least in my experience. I mean, maybe I'm not part of the same conversations or like reading the right things, but that feels like one of those things that was lost, that maybe it felt a lot more tangible. And you could say, we can actually describe the steps of how we would get to a society that would function in this way.
Right.
So it's kind of like really cool. And it just makes me realize, like, why don't we talk about that in the same way anymore?
I mean, I think that Shulamith Firestone was really unique in presenting that idea. I think even a lot of her peers thought it was a little too wacky. The same peers who are deciding that they shouldn't have sex with men anymore because that's anti-feminist and going off and living in their like lesbian communes, but that Shulamith Firestone's idea is maybe a little too weird.
She seems like she was a real anomaly, even for those that we look back now and say those were the most radical of that era, and she was even kind of hard to take for them.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of infighting in those feminist circles. Shulamith Firestone was not interested in that kind of, not even anti-man sentiment, but just the separatist idea. Like, she was not really excited about lesbian separatism, even though she was in the same milieu with those people and peers and friends with some of them. Yeah, her ideas were really out there because she stuck to the Marxism, to political revolution, in a way that I think a lot of feminists in that era saw the failure of revolution to address feminism as being like a perpetual failure, that kind of socialist political revolution, communism, would not solve this woman problem that was limited in that way.
Would you say that she, instead of rejecting the history and legacy of Marx and Marxism, sought to kind of expand that and radicalize that in a new way instead of discarding it?
Yeah, I think that's, and I mean, there were other feminists who thought the same way, but yeah, she was so inherently tied to, she wasn't saying Marx was wrong because he didn't address women. She wasn't saying the Russian Revolution was wrong because it didn't address women. What she was saying is like, this is all good stuff and we need to add this other dimension to it because it hasn't been addressed. I'm going to read a quote.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is actually about the Russian Revolution. In the section where she's laying out these possible futures and kind of society that doesn't look at the family as this core structure, she addresses directly the Soviet Union and that moment of collectivization. So I'm just going to read a slightly long quote. You can cut out some of it if you think it's boring. Of all the modern social experiments, the most important failure was that of the Russian communes. The failure of the Russian Revolution in general is a thorn in every radical's side, but its direct relation to the failure of the communes is seldom noted. It led, ironically, to the assumption of a causal connection between the abolition of the family and the development of a totalitarian state. In this view, the later Russian reinstitution of the nuclear family system is seen as a last-ditch attempt to salvage humanist values, privacy, individualism, love, etc., by then rapidly disappearing. But it is the reverse. The failure of the Russian Revolution to achieve the classless society is traceable to its half-hearted attempts to eliminate the family and sexual repression. And then she goes on. This failure, in turn, was due to the limitations of a male-biased revolutionary analysis based on economic class alone, one that failed to take the family fully into account, even in its function as an economic unit. By the same token, all socialist revolutions to date have been or will be failures for precisely this reason. Any initial liberation under current socialism must always revert back to repression because the family structure is the source of psychological, economic, and political repression. And here she's really referencing Reich And she's kind of referencing Arendt, I think, in less direct way. Socialist attempts to soften the structure of power within the family by incorporating women into the labor force or army are only reformist. Thus, it is no surprise that socialism, as it is now constituted in the various parts of the world, is not only no improvement on capitalism, but often worse.
Whew, that's hot fire. So hot fire right there.
Yeah, that last part probably wasn't as important as this middle, but I think that's kind of where you can see that Shulamith Firestone really, she saw herself as a Marxist, but I think that the Freud influence is stronger, or they're at least like they can't be pulled apart from each other. But I think, that quote really encapsulates the entire thesis of the book. The family and the role of women in the family, and the way that the structure of the family is a microcosm of all other oppression, of economic oppression, of racial oppression. And, that's where the race article, the race chapter kind of goes off the deep end, but it makes sense in context. But race relations, class exploitation, the relationships between men and women, they're all reenacted in this microcosm of the inequalities of the world within the inequalities and hierarchies of the family unit.
I'm having this total recall moment of all the Wilhelm Reich I've read, that it's I read all that for the interest in psychoanalysis and Freud, and then read all the Marx stuff, but now it's coming back to me of how I think this is something that is unfortunately lost for a lot of people on the left today, and people who call themselves Marxists, is that I think to even get to the step where you're talking about, let's say, ideological state apparatuses, or the sort of parts of the superstructure, right? If someone has this very vulgar, base superstructure kind of approach, I feel it's hard to even get to the point where you're able to think about schools and churches and legal institutions are these absolutely crucial sites of capitalist reproduction and the sort of relations of capitalism and the way that that's sexed and raced and everything that comes along with that, how those play into it. And it feels we're even farther away from understanding the role of the family as this core part of how all of those institutions function. It's no coincidence that whenever I think about, okay, what is it that defines a sort of conservative worldview, and even a lot of liberal and centrist worldviews, and makes them so strongly opposed to anything that's on the left and calls itself Marxist or whatever, it's always in the guise of family values. And to challenge that means you challenge the basic building blocks of what our society is. So it feels if we're not really addressing our critique towards capitalism at the level of the family, we're probably missing something very, very radical in our approach.
Yeah. And I think that Shulamith Firestone makes the point that the family is used ideologically as this kind of moral center, as this wholesome thing, as this exuding the qualities of privacy and love that are inherent to particularly American capitalist society that, are at its core. And then you look at the world around us now, and the things that make the largest legal gay marriage was palatable to mainstream liberals and now to almost all Americans, because it reinforces the wholesomeness of the family, of a structure that is limited and oppressive. When you looked at the ways that separating families at the border in detention zones, that was this way that suddenly all liberals suddenly seemed so invested in this is so wrong, this is not fair, when thousands of people were detained and held without any kind of legal recourse under the Obama administration. For the horrors of immigration were not palatable or understandable to people without putting it into this context of this oppressive structure that unites most of the Western world.
I mean, I think another thing about that too is it seems as if that whole critique based on this set of family values also didn't seem to really give a damn about what that larger structural factors were that were driving the immigration for so many years, mainly the U.S. backing coups and right-wing death squads all across Central and South America that was creating horrible instability and violence, that was causing these vast movements of people. And yeah, it isn't until, and again, I mean, it's horrible that families are separated in a lot of ways, but the fact that that is the catalyst that now has garnered national attention, I think speaks to all across the spectrum, the structure of the nuclear family still is what grounds and orients us towards the basic coordinates of our lives and how we think society should work, even whenever we're critical of it. I'm always trying to relate this stuff to on a deeply sort of like personal level of like, okay, what does politics look like in my day-to-day life? Or what does it mean? Like, why should we read and care about this shit? Because I think for a lot of the time, you were talking about Benjamin and Adorno and Frankfurt School stuff. The idea is that, well, all of this kind of theorizing can be separated from politics in some way. And I think it makes it very easy to dismiss it and to, it's like a convenient way that you get to avoid having to grapple with someone like Firestone, who is, just hearing you talk about it, is approaching these problems in an incredibly complex, creative, and innovative way. And, it takes work to sort of dig into that and to understand it. It's no secret that, especially among a lot of left groups, it's a persistent problem that, they can be very dominated by men, and men tend to dominate and control the space. And I think that there's a lot of talk, and there's a lot of trying to grapple with, okay, well, what would it look like to sort of not make this a male-dominated space? Yeah. But I think we don't really know how to do that more often than not. I don't think we have answers of what would it look like to radically critique the level of sort of what it is to be on the left that would actually change those patterns and structures in different ways. And I don't know. I mean, maybe part of it is we need to read stuff like The Dialectic of Sex to try to re-engage with some way to approach that. Would you say that's kind of been your experience too? Or I'm wondering what you think about how this sort of relates to just being on the left today and actually being in groups and trying to talk and organize with people.
It's really difficult. There's a whole lot of layers to it. I think that being intellectual woman in the left who participates in that capacity in any kind of way means that I'm often the only or one of 3 women in a room full of men. Sure. And often the only one who talks and says anything. And it is a weird experience, and it's frustrating. And I think works like The Dialectic of Sex kind of help me put things into perspective and try to figure out not why does this feel bad? Why does it feel weird? I know kind of intellectually that just having women be separate from men on the left is not going to fix things. It's not going to make it better. Yeah. It's you have these leftists who I think are just they're either tone deaf to the sort of structures, exploitation that they're recreating within their organizations, or they're so hyper attuned to it that it's annoying. The only thing that's more annoying than being a woman in a group of leftist men and trying to get a word in is being a woman in a group of leftist men who are all arguing about why they can't get any women to come to their group of leftist men, and still not being able to get a word in edgewise. So I think
shots fucking fired.
Yeah. That's just life. But I think that a work like The Dialectic of Sex really pulls apart those dynamics, and it says it isn't nihilistic in this way that's well, it's never going to be equal between men and women. What it says is there are all these things that exist in the world that perpetuate these power relationships, and a huge aspect of those things is the way that women are intrinsically tied to these bodies that are used for this kind of a reproductive utility that isn't connected to their being, to their ability to work, to their ability to exist in the world physically, intellectually, and so on. But if there isn't hierarchical relationship between, if you take away the things that make the relationships between men and women exploitative and unequal, then I get much more frustrated with the kind of contemporary feminist discourse than with stupid but well-intentioned leftist men.
Please say more. I'm very interested to hear this.
I think it's just being a woman sucks, and being a woman in capitalism sucks. I think that there's just this lost moment, when you have this urge towards social transformation for the way that women exist in the world, but that doesn't believe that there's a scope beyond capitalism. You know, I look at something like Me Too in particular is like, I feel very conflicted about it, because on the one hand, I feel like, yeah, I think rapists should be held accountable for their actions regardless of whether the law thinks that that's the case or not. And, you know, I think that there are a lot of exploitative elements of like sex and power relationships that are not addressed by the law, but that are wrong. It's going back to that, to first wave feminism that's just only aimed at having women equal men in their ability to exploit.
It's really interesting to hear you describe it that way, because I think a lot of times whenever you hear that kind of feminist discourse described today, it's described as being white feminism with a capital W and a capital F, or it's neoliberal feminism, the way that like Nancy Fraser or some social reproduction theorists would describe it. I've never actually heard anyone connect the dots that way and say this actually is very reminiscent of first wave. So I think that's a really fascinating way to look at it.
There's so much like virtue signaling tied up in feminism and feminist discourse, and I feel like it's really easy to just call something like that white feminism, but then the answer to that just being like, you should support businesses owned by Black gay women. Like, how is that better? How is that like going to change anything? What is the point of visibility if like the aims are all the same? It's just, people like to talk a whole big deal about intersectionality, but I think that part of what that does is just introduce more and more categories of fracture.
We were talking earlier about how Firestone is part of second wave feminism that's kind of been lost, and I'm reminded of another, it seems to me, very important part of second wave feminism that is also lost, which is the Combahee River Collective, which were a group of queer Black women Marxists. They didn't use this word specifically, but very clearly they were describing what they saw as being intersectionality, the way that we describe it now. You know, it's funny, Ruby, who will be on a future episode, we were talking about this the other day, and they had actually mentioned, you know, whenever we think back to second wave feminism and we see it as being this white sort of approach to feminism that didn't encapsulate these critiques of race and this understanding of like queerness and intersectionality, we totally obliterate and obscure from our historical kind of memory the fact that there were these movements there. They were always there and always a part of it. And so, you know, what does it do whenever we think about second wave feminism and we just completely blank all of that out and just interpret it in this one very specific way?
It erases this moment of history and like doesn't give, how do I put it, in like not giving credit where it's due, or like remembering these people, these communities. It both, we can't learn anything from it, and it also creates this space for like repetition of failure. Like if you don't, like what happened to that collective? I'm asking.
Oh, that's a legitimate question. I mean, in some ways they were never massive, but they did set up I think a clinic for women who have been sexually assaulted, for like a domestic violence shelter, and they did very radical things. And I think the way that they're discussed now, so Kienga Yamada Taylor just put out an edited collection of their original statement that they put out, which I really want us to do an episode on sometime, but interviews with the original founders. And, you know, I think if we look back to it and we say, okay, was there a radical revolutionary potential there? Yes, absolutely there was. In many ways, whenever I hear people talk about intersectionality, and I just sort of am mostly curious now, I'll ask them, like, whenever you think of intersectionality, like, who would you say developed that idea and coined that concept? Everyone will always say Kimberly Crenshaw, which it emerged out of legal studies, out of critical race theory about particular women dealing with particular criminal cases and sort of the effects of that. But it's just such a strange thing to me, and I have this weird obsession with like loss of memory right now in terms of political moments on the left. And I mean, maybe part of it is that they didn't, for whatever reason, we don't see them as making a big enough historical imprint that we actively remember them in a way. But, you know, here we are, like, in 2019, and we're talking about them, and they just had a new statement published. I mean, in some ways, I can't help but think, and maybe this is sort of my, like, Marxist, deeply suspicious nature about ideology, that it definitely serves the reproduction of capital in all sorts of ways if we forget and we obscure and we erase these moments whenever these things did come together and these radical ways of understanding how do we critique capitalism and account for, let's say, queerness and being a woman of color, and saw that as not an end point but a starting point, which is something they explicitly said. They said we have to organize from where we're at. We have to start from where we're at, but we never end there. Where you go after that is essentially to just become radical fucking Marxists was kind of their approach.
Yeah, which is not what the end point is for those movements. When you hear people speaking in that same kind of language, their logical endpoint is not I should be a radical Marxist. It's something else. It's something like, I mean, in the most conservative sense, like I should vote for Democrats. Like there's a lot of these kind of smaller, if the only power is in kind of identifying, if all you're doing is identifying all the ways in which you're oppressed or someone else is oppressed, but not the steps that would have to be taken by the society that produces that oppression to make it go away, then like, you know, what's the point?
My impression, and, you know, running in the circles that I have run in, my feeling is always that what you are sort of led to is, I think you sort of get on that path, but there's a complete just sort of gap there about what would the next step be.
Yeah.
And I think that what the ideology of capital and all of these oppressive structures as they exist, what they do is they very quickly come in to fill the void.
Yeah.
Okay, like I know that I'm critical of issues of structural racism and gender inequality and all these other things, and I'm now aware of that. You know, I've like become woke, and I like now, you know, have my merit badge for being woke. But if you don't have a clear idea of what it would actually mean to undermine those structures, what would a transformation look like? I think what else are you left with but to say, well, maybe we vote in particular ways. Maybe we support businesses of a particular kind run by particular people who fit into groups that are oppressed or marginalized. I think that, you know, capitalism is very, very insidious in that way.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is maybe a little simplistic, but I don't know. I mean, no one is born, you know, revolutionary Marxist. Everyone has to get there. And I think if you haven't grown up where that's just part of your conversation, I mean, you know, it took me 20, 30 years to eventually get to that point. And I think along the way, whenever I think back on it now, it seems like the trick or what you were always trying to overcome was the way that the second you're critical of something, the answer that just conveniently reinforces the exact systems because it doesn't critique them in a more structural, radical way, they're just laying there for you to find. They're really accessible. And I think it's harder to find, for good reason, I think it's harder to find a perspective that allows you to really undermine those things that they're the core features of what makes them sort of be perpetuated and reproduce themselves.
To address your statement, but also to get back to the text, because I think we're like a little far afield from it, is, you know, what Shulamith Firestone is identifying here is she's critiquing this idea that, you know, after the Marxist revolution, all the other problems of inequality will fall into place. But she isn't saying, oh, well, first you have to fix sexism, first you have to fix racism, and then you can have revolution that's equal. I think her point is more that, like, there are the power relationships between men and women predate capitalism. And I think racism in the United States is very explicitly tied to the slave trade, imperialism, that early form of capitalism and the development of a colonized country. And in the complicated race section of the book, Shulamith Firestone makes this case that, like, the relationships between white men and black men are like a reification of the relationships between men and women.
So we just hit one of our words of the day, which is reification. There we go.
All right.
So for someone who has never heard that, how would you describe what reification is?
Reification is, how do I say this without just like more complicated words?
Like when Marxist.
Yeah. When you recreate and reproduce society in like ways that are, oh man, I'm so bad at this.
This is like such a hard question to ask someone.
Yeah, it's like I had such a hard time understanding reification, and now that I understand it, I like can't explain it. But you know, essentially, like, things exist in this certain way, and then you identify that they exist and they're recreated, and then that recreation of them re-solidifies that is the way that they are, or it reproduces that idea. In the context that I'm talking about, you have this, to put it in the most crude Freudian terms, basically all men and women have this like sub-dom relationship, and then the relationships between white men and black men in the US under capitalism reflect that sub-dom relationship of exploitation, even though it is a different relationship and it exists in a different kind of sphere. It's a way that people see each other as weaker, as less valuable, as existing in a different kind of, as being other in a really fundamental way.
That's actually really good. So it's almost like it would take that idea of like sub-dom and just kind of replicate that and reproduce that in all these different types of relationships.
Yeah, so the relationship between adults and children, the relationships between white people and any other race of people. I just want to be clear too that I'm not saying that like Shulamith, that everything in the Dialectic of Sex is something that I agree with or that I think is just like the right interpretation, but I do think that it's interesting and it makes a lot of sense. It's in certain ways it's reductive, but in other ways it makes it easier to understand the case that Firestone is making for why like you need to get rid of these things that they aren't just signifiers of difference. I think I've said a lot of what's important about this book. Shulamith Firestone is she's just been a really influential figure to me, and the Dialectic of Sex has helped me make a lot of connections between like Freudianism, Marxism, capitalism, American history, the ways that society has moved so far from this ideological, this utopian moment for feminism. And I just think this book is really worth reading. And, when I read it, I can't believe that this isn't something that's as canon as de Beauvoir. I think Firestone is expressing all of the potential of this moment in American history for radical Marxism, radical feminism, radical anti-racism, art. She's in this scene of radical creative people and is like way better than Valerie Solanas. Just gonna throw that out there.
I was wondering if that name would come up at some point.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of sad story of the day. Firestone published this book in 1970. She was 25, and she spent most of the rest of her life in and out of mental hospitals with really crippling psychosis, and she was not able to continue to produce this kind of level of theory or to like speak for herself publicly throughout time the way that a lot of, like Marcuse could have done. And I think that's really a shame. I don't know, maybe she would have just like become a conservative like so many other utopian radicals. But I think that's maybe part of it too, is produce this really awesome thing, and then she kind of couldn't live in that. She wasn't physically able to exist in that world full time anymore, and then that world stopped existing. So
well, it almost seems like this work in particular is sort of a testament to her, like her vision and of a time that dissolved or faded. I don't know, it seems like of all the second wave feminist texts that I've read or like heard about or have learned about, there's something about this one that seems to have, it sort of reminds you of the radical potential that was there.
Right.
Something you said, I really appreciate that you said this too, is I think, in my experience, a lot of times whenever we read any sort of book or like theory or encounter a position or an argument, I think this happens to all of us. The like sea that we swim in, that we grow up in, I think it's so easy to just completely reject it if we don't agree with everything. So I really appreciate that you were saying, this is reductive in some ways, which is what second wave feminism is usually accused of being, and then completely discarded in mass. I think it's helpful to think about, like this book is reductive in certain ways, but it's filled with so much radical potential and it's still very, very sort of relevant and salient for the same problems that we're dealing with today. And it still has potential to offer ideas about what it would actually look like to, revolutionize the world in a way that would be that would keep alive some vision that we could say is, Marxist and feminist and anti-racist and all these other things. And I think that's what, I feel like we need all of that stuff we can get.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think just like a closing thing that popped into my head and I feel like is a good way to end is the feminist theory that prefigures Firestone. You look at Freud, you look at de Beauvoir, you look at Fanon. They're all writing from this place of oppression as in kind of forms of the negative, that this thing only exists because it is what the dominant figure is not. It's a negative definition. And I think that what Shulamith Firestone does in the Dialectic of Sex that's so awesome is it is a positive representation. It's saying like it's making a case for something that women aren't just men without the thing. Like they're, men are women without this crippling, almost disability of being mothers, and that once that thing is fixed, then there isn't that difference anymore. And it just really transforms the perspective, the like stance that you're taking there. I don't know, it's just really great. It doesn't have that hopeless feeling that you get when you read Fanon, de Beauvoir or Irigaray or like any, even Judith Butler, like all these people, because it's not just this is how women are different from men. This is how, like, it's saying here are that these differences aren't inherently unequal, and here are the things that we can do to just make it not a problem anymore.
I think that's one of the most like hopeful kind of utopian radical futurist kind of ideas, that there is a way to understand difference without oppression and inequality. And it seems like that's kind of what Firestone is trying to get at, of like, what would it be like to think of difference not through these sort of lenses of historical oppression and marginalization and exploitation and all these different ways that it typically functions.
Yeah, and once you take away the aspects of difference that keep people tied to their oppression, it's just like it's a different character, a different aspect. It's just a different world, and it's not categorically separate identity of human being.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's probably the best place to end. The most radical idea that I can imagine coming out of this particular book. So, Comrade Zoya, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. This was really great.
Cool. Would you want to do another one sometime?
Could I talk about Star Trek?
Well, yeah. I mean, honestly, I think now that we've opened the Gene Roddenberry Star Trek sort of wing of the whole discussion, I feel like we'd have to do that.
All right. So, put it on the shelf.
Star Trek and philosophy. Is that what book you want to talk about?
I guess maybe we could think about it as something like how to study Star Trek as a Marxist.
I'm done. I want to do a 25-part series on that. So you're now locked into every episode of that 25-part series.
Okay. Yeah. Professor of Marxist Star Trekology.
Listen, all these degrees are just made up anyway. I think that is a completely legitimate degree.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, we'll start playing. Comrades, hope you didn't get burned too bad by some of that hot fire that Comrade Zoya was spitting throughout that episode. Big thanks to her for coming on and sharing with me a thinker and a book I had never heard of before, and I'm so very grateful that I know of now. And I hope you also got inspired to maybe go check out a little bit more about Shulamith Firestone, some of her work, her thought, because I think it's incredibly valuable and maybe speaks to one of those lost futures that Mark Fisher talked about, which we discussed a bit in the episode. Coming up next week, we're going to have Comrade Courtney on to talk about the very excellent analytical Marxist thinker Adam Prejworski, Przeworski's book, Capitalism and Social Democracy. Now, I want to set this one up a little bit more than I normally would because I think it is so incredibly relevant for the political landscape we find ourselves in now. Przeworski's book takes a historical view on the relationship between socialist projects of revolution and radical transformation and their relationship to electoral politics and the strategy of winning enough support from the masses through electoral means to bring about that revolutionary program. Now, with Big Daddy Bernie just announcing his 2020 run, I know there's going to be a lot of memeing, a lot of discussion about the relationship between socialist politics and electoral strategy, so I think this is just in time to maybe give us some more historical perspective and critical ways to analyze the deeply inherent contradictions within the combination of electoral politics and socialist strategy. So join us for that next week, and in the meantime, please subscribe to the show on iTunes, find us on Patreon if you'd like to donate a few bucks, give us a good review, mercilessly indoctrinate your friends and family with the message that we're putting out here on the show, and as always, keep thinking, keep reading, keep writing, keep talking, keep fighting, doing that beautiful Leftosphere work that you do, and we'll see you back here next time.